Hi guys, welcome back to the next episode of Don't Fear the Weight with me, your TinyTitan host, Vicky Masita. For the first time in 4 episodes, I have actually said my name right. I think it's been the experience of being in lockdown. Apparently now I can't even say my own name, which is just really bloody annoying. However, on this episode, I'm really excited. I've got a good friend of mine by the name of Mr. Tony Montgomery, who is joining us to talk about a lot of training and a lot of mind-muscle connections and just basically winging the conversation like we always do. But Tony, how are you?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I can't wait to have this conversation. I look forward to it. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, I'm very excited to get into the nitty-gritty of it. I've heard you a few times in terms of different podcasts and that kind of thing, and I've always been excited about training. Training is something that really does kind of like get my gears going, which I know it does you. So I'm really excited about getting into this conversation realistically. But for people who haven't listened to your podcasts in the past, can you just give us a little bit about you, your background, and why I'm so excited about speaking to you this episode?
Yeah, definitely. So I've been in the strength, I would say strength community, not strength and conditioning, but strength community for a little over a decade, doing strongman and powerlifting myself as a competitive athlete. And then also just coaching and doing, I've owned 2 gyms. I've done online coaching for the last 6 years, working on just kind of building those things. I'm currently in my master's program at University of South Florida, where we were focusing on a lot of physique enhancement type stuff with Professor Bill Campbell, who does a lot of research on physique enhancement. So I've been in the field for a little bit over a decade, focusing on mostly just strength athletes and body composition stuff as well on the nutrition side. And then myself just being a competitive athlete, now focusing a little bit more on combat sports and jiu-jitsu and a little bit less on powerlifting and strongman. And then once I get done with my master's, the plan is to pursue a PhD along the same lines of either strength and conditioning realm or any type of physique enhancement platform that's available.
That's cool. That's really exciting. So what I really find interesting, it's happened over the past few kind of people who I've spoken to, actually. There's this big crossover from powerlifting and strongman and then going into the martial arts, more along the lines of like BJJ. So what kind of tickled your fancy about going from lifting barbells to slamming people on their backs?
Yeah, so before I got into the barbell lifting, I did MMA for about 2 to 3 years. I did it in the military as well. I served 4 years in the Marine Corps, and we did some mixed martial arts there. So I was really into that. But I've had one too many traumatic brain injuries, so I wasn't able to continue to pursue that. So it's something that I've always loved. I always loved MMA. I was fascinated by it. And then now getting towards the tail end of powerlifting, especially as an enhanced powerlifter, I was really focused on trying to regain some health aspects and regain some athleticism. And BJJ is one of those things that allows you to do that without actually having any more head trauma. And that's the route that I wanted to go. It's the only sport that I can think of that will allow me to be competitive, but also not cause any deleterious health effects with any type of drugs or performance enhancing type stuff. And then it also won't cause any health effects with any brain damage or anything like that. And then I think just from the analytical side of things, it's a very intellectual sport when it comes to interacting with continuing to take in feedback systems and then having to adjust those things on the fly. So it's a very intellectual demanding sport as well, whereas you may develop your game against one person and then the next person comes up and you have to do something completely different. A lot of thinking on the fly, a lot of like chess match type scenario stuff. So it's very much entertaining in that aspect as well. It doesn't seem like it'll get boring. So I think a lot of people transfer over from strength sports because it's a very much a mundane sport where you just do the same things over and over again. And you go into something that allows you to be a little bit more athletic, and it also challenges you differently every single day you're there. So I would have to assume that that's a big appeal. And then obviously Joe Rogan, Jocko Willenick, guys like that are promoting it. And then also within our own industry, you have the whole Renaissance periodization team that promotes it. So it's just, if people hear it enough times, they get interested and they go and do it.
That's it. It's going to be one of those not one of those new like fad diet things. Can you imagine? Because like we're just spreading out fad diets so much, and people are like, yeah, okay, let's go keto. And it's just like, yeah, okay, let's go BJJ.
Yeah, I can support that fad for sure. The other ones maybe not so much, but BJJ is definitely a great sport to get into, especially for female athletes. I think just the idea of some type of self-defense or some type of combative sport is always good, whether it be BJJ, Muay Thai, anything along those lines. I think is always really, really good for women to get into.
For sure. It's quite empowering as well, isn't it? It's like powerlifting for women, I find really empowering anyway. But I mean, if you can actually say, yeah, you can pretty much do some self-defense if somebody tries to steal your handbag.
Yeah,
That's
it's
quite
definitely yeah, oh definitely, yeah. And the better you, I mean, I've gone against some purple belt, black belt women who were half my size, and they were extremely hard to do anything with. So I couldn't only imagine the type of empowerment that it could give you to be able to defend yourself against just anybody randomly on the street. You can walk a little bit safer, which I think is something that is very important for women to start to do.
Totally agree. It's funny, because I'm obviously a little bit older now than some of these young whippersnappers who are doing the podcasts out there in the day. But when I was younger, I did jujitsu in Cyprus. And it was really empowering to get, and when I look back on it now, because I was one of the only girls in the group that I did the jiu-jitsu with, my sensei was just like this little guy. He looked like an albino with no hair and, blonde eyelashes and looked completely different. And he was just this meek and mild individual, but dangerous as hell. Like, he could just explode into this aggressiveness, which was just incredible. But then we had another sensei, and she was actually one more dan above him. And she actually explained the mentality and the psychological aspect of things, where you do think, yeah, I know all of these martial arts, I know all these movements, and I know how to protect myself. And she got mugged. So she got mugged on the streets of Cyprus, and she basically beat them off with her handbag and did nothing with her martial arts skills at all. She literally just beat him up with a handbag. It was just an interesting thing, because we're going to cross over to like mind muscle connections and things like that. But from a psychological point of view, have you ever, I mean, obviously it's different for you because you served in the Marine Corps and things, but have you ever heard stories like that where psychologically you know that you're empowered, you know that you have that skill, but then all of a sudden when you are faced with the actual competition, that just goes all out of the window?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, you see that in the military too, right? You do all the training you can, but then as soon as you get inoculated into a stressful situation, those fight or flight mechanisms take over. And you hope that you've done enough to ingrain those patterns to where it becomes second nature. But I've seen it at jiu-jitsu tournaments. I've seen it in combat where, all the training in the world sometimes doesn't necessarily correlate to being able to do that in real world time. And I think a lot of it just has to do with, it could be visualization, imagery type stuff when it comes to athletics, right? Being able to put yourself in that situation and see it happen time and time again, to where when it does start to present itself in real life, it's not as overwhelming as it could be. But then there's just some people, I think genetically, who either have it or they don't, right? There's people that, whenever you're faced with that fight or flight or freeze component, some people go face on and head on and charge, and some people freeze and some people run away. And I think that that's something that is ingrained in their DNA. And I think you have to have some type of inoculation experiences to allow yourself to make it become second nature. So you can be the most well-rounded martial arts person in the world within that environment, but then once you're out in the streets, it's an environment that you're not used to. So, survival instincts will always overtake your ability to combat some of the things that you've learned.
Absolutely. It's so incredible how powerful the mind is. And some people kind of say, oh, it's mind over matter. And it's so true. Yeah. And it can be crossed over into powerlifting as well. So I mean, it's like I say to my clients who are going up for their first heavy squat, and they get all of that nerves and all of that thing, and they just kind of think, oh my God, that's such a heavy squat. It's like, well, now that you're going to fail that, because you've literally walked up to that bar and that bar has made you its bitch, rather than the other way around. So you just have to go up and just imagine yourself and visualize yourself actually performing that squat so that it's easy, and just keep on telling yourself that it's so easy, and then you'll lift it. I mean, are you of an agreement with that? Do you play a lot of psychology into the power lifts when you do your coaching?
With my athletes, I try to do a little bit of that, depending on what their background is and what maybe issues they've had. Like recently, I've just started working with an athlete who's had meet week anxiety issues. So we've been doing some type of stress. The idea, if you look at some of the research on stress, if you're able to create the stress environment yourself and then go head on into them, that perception of stress is dealt with a lot differently. Your body responds to it because it's something that you've brought about yourself instead of something that you're reacting to. So for him, his competition's not till maybe July timeframe. So we've been working on some things to be able to control sympathetic and parasympathetic arousal so that he's not going to have as much anxiety throughout the meet week that he used to have. And then also too, some type of visualization component for that can help out a lot. So we've been doing some type of ice bath type stuff once a week, not necessarily from the recovery component, but just from the idea of if we're able to present that stressor on our own, and then we can have that sympathetic arousal from getting in the ice bath, and then really focus on trying to get parasympathetic tone as fast as possible while being in that, can have a better transfer effect over whenever that anxiety comes up at a meet. He'll be able to control it a lot better. So that helps out a lot. Doing some type of physiological size can also work well. It's 2 nasal breaths in and then a short exhale. That connects the pheneric nerve, which connects to the diaphragm, which helps with parasympathetic tone as well. So if you're overly aroused or high anxiety situations, being able to do a physiological sigh can help bring that down. So it's just more or less teaching them very much real world antidotes that can be practical, like immediately going into it to control that. Some people can't necessarily correlate visualization and imagery with actually being able to present that on the platform. So if we can give them some like actual attainable things to do that they feel like they have control over, then they feel a little bit more empowered during that as well. So it creates a little bit more buy-in. Could be a placebo effect as well. If they know they have control over it, that can help out a lot. So we do some of that depending on if the athlete has issues or not.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, cool. So that was a nice little introduction to yourself, wasn't it? I think we got your background, a bit of knowledge, some BJJ, and some psychological hippie woo-woo stuff. So
a little bit of everything.
Right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty then of what I invited you on here for. So mind-muscle connections. What is it in some of the things that you have seen? I mean, I'm obviously just like stalking some of your social media that I have done for many a long time now. I have loved the idea of you actually saying that it is just beyond weight. You don't just move weight from one place to the other. There has to be a significant connection between yourself and the weight that you are moving. So in your explanation and in your expertise, how would you explain mind-muscle connection, and why is it important in strength sports?
Yeah, so mind-muscle connection is kind of like your ability to intrinsically connect with the muscle to create as much muscle activation as possible. And the idea behind that is thinking more or less internal drive versus external drive, internal cues versus external cues, and how that can help with skill acquisition of the movement. So within the sport of powerlifting, skill acquisition is a key component to getting stronger. It might be the most important skill in terms of getting stronger, is being able to perform the movements and get really good at them time and time again, because we know that neural adaptation is one of the main driving forces of strength when it comes to beginners and getting stronger. And the idea of what's going to allow for the best performance possible is going to be something that drives those skill acquisitions. So if you're cueing someone, the idea of we need to get your lats tighter on a squat because you have some type of rotational movement of the bar, right? Because the lats as a functional movement create anti-rotation through your core. So if we tell them to get their lats tighter and they've never been able to use their lats on any exercise, it's going to be a huge disconnect for them to actually focus on those cues and get those cues to where they need to be and actually activate the muscles that need to be activated when you are given those cues. So if you think of mind-muscle connection in terms of how it can transfer over into strength sports, the idea is whenever you're given certain cues to an athlete, they can actually put those cues into practice a little bit better. Now, in terms of actual performance per se, we've seen the research on it, and then external drive is actually what performs better. So given more of these external cues instead of internal cues is actually going to help an athlete perform at a higher level. So an external cue would be, say for bench press, you're telling someone to or push yourself into the ground or throw the bar off your chest. That's going to produce better performance outcomes than the idea of squeeze your chest together, right? Or squeeze your lats. But if they don't have that mind muscle connection and they have an issue with their lats being able to stabilize, and you tell them to squeeze their lats and they've never done it before, then there's going to be a disconnect with their ability to stabilize the weight under or the load within their bodies, because they've never actually taken the time to understand development of the mind muscle connection. So when thinking of it in terms of strength athletics, it may not be the best thing to do when trying to actually learn the skill. A study by Wolf in 2012 showed that for motor learning, for greater motor learning ability and skill acquisition, external cues are going to be far better to do that than internal cues. So you want to think about how can we get the best out of that person? What cues are going to give us the best performance? And then if they're having issues with some type of muscle activation and their ability to kind of correlate a cue to being able to actually present it on the platform, that's when you start looking into that mind muscle connection and internal drivers to get those muscles firing.
That's cool. That was a lot of information there. So let's break it down then into the bench, because a lot of people just kind of think, right, well, I'm just going to drag the bar to my chest and then I'm just going to push it up. So realistically, that's not how we bench. I know this. I'm a Commonwealth bencher. That's my little medal there. So I did the Commonwealth. I know how to bench. But let's actually really break it down and start from an optimal setup. So somebody who is always being told to keep tight, for example. So because I hear that so much with powerlifting coaches, they literally just kind of say, just keep tight. And it's like, well, yeah, but what does that mean? That
Right.
means nothing. Where do you keep tight? What are you supposed to do with your feet? Do you have a specific setup? And that kind of thing. So if we take, say, a novice, let's go with a female bench presser, because that's our weakest press at the end of the day, isn't it? So let's take one of those. How would you explain for somebody who's always just been told to keep tight but has never progressed their bench? How would you break that down for them? And I know it's very person specific and that you would need to see somebody's bench, but
Right. So the idea of keeping tight is you want to think about where exactly are going to be those demands, like where are the distal demands in relation to proximity of midline that you need to stabilize and keep tight. So the points of contact are going to be your hands on the bar and then your feet on the ground. So that would be the first two things that I would always focus on when trying to explain the keep tight portion to an athlete, right? So let's just assume that their setup is good. They have their shoulder blades maybe depressed and pulled and retracted back a little bit. I know there's a little bit of controversy in that, but that's perfectly fine. We can talk about that as well. Mm-hmm. But so once that's all set up, and then you want to think about, okay, well, what am I doing to create as much tension as possible? And that's the idea of keeping tight, right? So you have your feet rooted into the ground and you're kind of actively trying to grab the ground with your feet. And that's going to create a base of stability on the floor. And then that's also going to activate everything from your feet all the way up into your core in terms of the bench press goes. So then you want to be able to think, well, I need to transfer as much force as possible. So everything needs to be grounded and rooted into the ground so that force transfer is apparent. So from there, you go from your feet all the way to your core, thinking about how can I brace my abdominals? What does my breath pattern look like? And then once you're able to create that brace in the core, then that force is going to continue to transfer all the way into your trap. So if there's ever a weak link within the brace dynamic or within the root dynamic, you're going to have minimal force transfer. Same thing with the barbell. Once the bar is in your hand, you want to make sure that you're able to pretty much think like if you're trying to throw a punch into the bar, you're trying to dig your hand in as much as you can to get as much surface area of your hand on the bar as possible, and understanding that the tighter you can grip it, the more force production you're going to have as well. And then that's also going to create a lot of tension and tightness throughout the movement. So by doing that, you're squeezing the bar, you're grabbing it, and then you want to think, okay, well, how do I activate my lats to create some stability within that movement? And then it's as simple as just trying to do like a dumbbell pullover, like you're trying to pull the bar over into you to activate your lats. And that all comes from your ability to squeeze the bar as tight as possible. So it's the idea is trying to create as much force production by squeezing into the ground and squeezing into the bar. That's going to create a lot of tightness throughout that movement. So whenever you yell the cue, get tight, which is, to some people can be very irrelevant nomenclature, but if you're a coach that has gone over the procedures of how to do that, then those one word cues are actually very practical, right? To that athlete. But to anyone else, you say get tight and you're like, well, yeah, of course, like that athlete's going to try to get tight. What does that actually mean? But being able to take that athlete from unracking the bar to pressing the bar as a coach, you'll give a lot of internal and external cues to do that. But then when it comes down to actually moving the weight, you want to focus on just one cue that athlete resonates best with. Because if you're trying to throw out 10, because we see that too at meets, right? Where somebody's like, get tight, root the ground, brace, grab the bar. It's like, fuck, you just told them 10 different things. How are they going to do anything, right? So minimizing how much actual verbal cueing you do is going to be very beneficial to your performance. But all the practice leading up to that is when you do a lot of that internal, external cues and you start to micromanage that a lot more, say in the warm-ups or things of that nature.
That's could you imagine if you're doing like 10 different verbal cues whilst the athlete's trying to do those nasal breaths and calm themselves down? Right. They're just going to be all over.
Yeah, I've seen, when you're first working with an athlete and you go over some of the stuff that they may be presenting themselves to do wrong in a video critique, right? I try to just do one critique at a time. It's like, what's the most important thing to critique? That's what we're going to fix first. But then I had some athletes where, a couple months into it, we've gone over 3 cues, and as they're going to set up for the lift, I can see in their face, they're thinking about everything that they need to do. And it's like, you've already lost your ability to, drive that weight off the ground or, squat the weight up because you're overthinking it. You can't overthink when it comes to performance. You just have to react. And the overthinking comes in the practice realm of the actual warm-ups and training considerations.
Definitely. And I really agree with that overthinking element. Sometimes when you just go for that third lift and it's going to be your PR and you just overthink the weight that you're just going to put on, and then you just get so anxious walking up to the bar and stuff. And let's face it, it is not a PR if it isn't ugly as shit. So that last lift is going to be ugly as hell because otherwise it's not going to be a PR. But as long as you obviously feel the movement and the bar just does not stop traveling in the correct direction, it can be ugly. You'll feel battered by the end of it, but it can be ugly. So you mentioned a little bit about controversy in terms of depressed and retracted scapula. So let's go on that, because I'm a depressed scapular bench presser, and that's how I am in my most prominent position in order to be the most powerful. So why do you think that it's a bit of a controversial subject in that realm?
Yeah, before we do that, I just want to give kind of a little bit of a evidence-based approach to what I just said as well, because I feel like anecdotally you can tell a lot of things, but you have some science to back it up as well. There was a study. I'm not like Dr. Scott where I can just remember things, so I have notes and I have to write them down. But there was a study.
Dr. Scott is a bit of an anomaly when it comes to that.
There was a study with Snyder and Fry in 2012. It was on Division III football players, which is something that's a little bit more applicable. You'll see a lot of studies on non-trained and untrained people doing muscle-mind or mind-muscle connection stuff. And it's like, it doesn't really make sense. But they found that on the bench press, focusing on squeezing the chest led to an increase in pec activation by 22% with loads of 50%. And as they got up to 80%, they found that only 13.3% was actually activated. So the heavier the weight, the less you're able to actually activate singular muscles if you're internally cueing them. Sure. So they found similar results when told to focus on the triceps. So they concluded that internal cues are more effective with lighter loads. So you're able to do more with lighter loads and internal cues. So that's the idea of warming up. Internal cues are going to be very effective. But then as you get to your working weights, external cues and focusing on one thing at a time is going to produce better results in your ability to actually lift the weight. And the research on that shows that if you're able to lift the weight as fast as possible, that's going to actually activate the same amount of muscles as if you were focused on that internal mind muscle connection. So the idea should always be lift the weight as fast as possible in order for you to get as much muscle activation as possible. So the The retraction and depression of the shoulder blades is something that we're taught a lot as powerlifters when it comes to the bench press, right? And the idea is that it's going to help create some stability within that movement pattern, because you're locking things down and you're putting things in certain positions to where the ball and the socket joint of the glenohumeral is going to be in a more stable environment to produce as much force as possible. So if the idea is we want to produce as much force as possible as a powerlifter, we want to create as stable of an environment as we can. And you have to understand that from the shoulder joint perspective, stability comes from the scapula. It also comes from the bicep, and it comes from the tricep as well. So, and from the pecs. So people don't, when people say to not retract your shoulder blades, they're also discounting the fact that stability comes from all three of those other components, right? And I think a lot of people that say don't retract your shoulder blades also think about muscle activation. And muscle activation doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to produce as much force as far as like movement concern, right? Because if you're looking at EMG, right, if we protract our shoulder blades, we're going to be able to shorten that muscle as much as possible. EMG is always going to favor a shortened muscle over a non-shortened muscle. So if you look at the EMG studies, yes, a protracted shoulder blade is going to allow you to create a shorter muscle in the pec, but does that necessarily mean that that's going to end up being a better force producer in terms of actually being able to do the skill of the bench press? And the likelihood of that is no, right? You're going to be able to produce more force if you have a more stable component. So understanding that the lats create stability, the biceps create stability, the triceps, the scapula, and the pec all create stability within the shoulder joint. You have to think about those all five things in conjunction and integration. So whenever you isolate something like a scapula and say that that's not the way to do it, then you're discounting every single thing else. And, whenever you're speaking in black and white without any contextual, concepts behind it, then you're just trying to make a statement that just makes you sound a little bit uneducated. And I know that a lot of people that do that, they're just trying to create that shock value instead of actually educating people. And I'm not a huge fan of that when it comes to, educators online. They're trying to create something that's not there. And I think if you fully look at biomechanics of bench press and being able to produce force and understanding stability is going to allow you to do that, having a retracted and depressed shoulder blades is going to put you in not only the most stable position, but it's also going to put you in the safest position as well, because you're locking in that shoulder blade. Yes, you may not get as much pec activation as you want. And we know this, right? You don't, for the most part, right? Most people don't bench press to get bigger chest, sure, right? We've seen that in bodybuilding, right? So of course, that's just in the thing of isolating a movement and saying that you need to do it a certain way. It's like, well, why don't we just find a better movement, right? Why don't we just do dumbbell bench press that allows for more free scapular retraction, or cable flies or something along those lines, right? But it's just one of the issues with the fitness industry is people trying to separate themselves and talking in black and whites without actually understanding the full conceptual idea of what the movement is and what it's for, right? Strength athletes are going to have a completely different concept of what to do within a lift than a bodybuilder will. And there has to be that discussion first and foremost before actually saying things in black and white. And you can never say things in black and white. That's, within our industry, there's so much nuance and so much, context that needs to be put onto it to create an actual discussion. But it's just something that's lacking. But yeah, I definitely think that, creating as much stability within that bench press is going to allow you to produce as much force as possible in the safest manner as possible. And if you're able to train safely, then you're going to get stronger just because you're not actually getting injured all the time and having to take, days off and weeks off and things of that nature.
And then you've got longevity in your career.
Yeah, exactly. So that should be, it's focusing on 1 rep max strength should also be focusing on longevity in your career, because you're only going to be as strong as you are healthy.
Absolutely. Totally agree. So I think that actually transfers really nicely into the secondary aspect of mind muscle connection, then, with what you were talking about in comparison to building a bigger chest as opposed to just being overall strong. Because let's face it, the bench press is still a very compound full body movement, because you are pressing your feet into the ground, you are throwing yourself back in to push the bar away. Whereas in a bodybuilder's isolation movement, if they're not going to be doing a bench press, but they are going to be doing, say, like a fly, that is going to be much more isolated. So let's have the crossover conversation in terms of a mind muscle connection for aesthetics and body composition as opposed to strength?
Yeah, so definitely the idea of when strength athletics, you're trying to make the movement as efficient as possible. You're not trying to create a lot of damage. You're not trying to make a movement harder to focus on the muscle. You're just trying to complete the lift. Whereas in bodybuilding, you're trying to be as mechanically disadvantaged as possible so that you can put as much stress onto the actual muscle as you can, right? So within, say, the paradigm of a bench press, right? The idea of a bench press to be able to move as much weight as possible is you're going to try to stack, joints on top of each other, bone structure on top of each other. You want your wrist to be stacked on your elbow, and that needs to be in line with your humerus so that you can create as much force as you can. But if you're thinking from a bodybuilder perspective, you're trying to make the most disadvantageous lever that you can. So your elbows or your wrist is actually going to be outside of your elbow. So you're thinking of a press more so where instead of it being directly in front of your knuckles, you're actually just extending it out, because that's going to create a longer lever, which is going to challenge the muscle a lot more in the lengthened position. And that's kind of the idea, is being able to challenge the muscle as much as you can. So in terms of mind-muscle connection is once you understand the biomechanics of how to challenge the muscle, then it's thinking about, well, how can I get the most activation out of that muscle as possible? And some of the research on that tends to favor the idea of internal cueing is going to allow for your ability to activate more muscle. A study by Merchant and et al. In 2017 found that looked at leg extensions and found internal cueing increased electrical activity of all quads. They couldn't isolate the VMO, but in terms of the entire quad muscles getting activated, the internal cueing actually helped outperform the external cueing in that study. So that's something to think about. Now, performance-wise, they both perform exactly the same. But as far as muscle activation goes, the internal cueing was able to activate more. So you want to think about, well, how much of those reps can I get as much muscle activation as possible? And the internal cueing is going to allow you to have more effective reps from set to set. So think about it in terms of, if you're able to feel that muscle work on rep 1, instead of when you get to rep 15, when you're already highly fatigued, every single one of those reps are going to create more and more muscle damage, which is going to create your ability to have more muscle protein synthesis, which is going to create your ability to build more muscle. So thinking about how can I get from rep 1 all the way to rep 15 as much muscle activation as possible is extremely important. There's another study by Counts et al. In 2016. This was on untrained people. So, but it kind of gives you the dynamic of like how much the internal cueing can help. One group was just flexing their biceps, and it had comparative growth to a group that was actually doing bicep curls with 70%. So one group was just actively flexing their bicep against air, trying to get focused on that internal cueing, mind-muscle connection. And then another group did 70% of actual load, and they found that not only did the strength improve, but the muscle hypertrophy improved as well on the group that was just flexing on air. So that internal cueing shows that, there might be something to that mind-muscle connection. There might be something to your ability to activate as many muscles as possible with lesser loads, with the idea of trying to focus on the specific muscle group that you can, whereas external cueing is going to it's going to move the weight and you're going to get some muscle activation, but it may not be as isolated as you want it to be.
That's very interesting. And then people are moaning now saying that they can't create hypertrophy with bands at home in lockdown.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can look at some of the research on blood flow restriction training. They did BFR on people walking on a treadmill and they were able to have muscle hypertrophy. So, there's always a way to get it done.
Oh, it's just mad, isn't it? We've been doing it wrong all these years by trying to lift massive heavy loads and get jacked. I think that's what my problem is. I think that's why I'm so tiny. I'm just too strong to get muscle hypertrophy.
Yeah, just put a BFR cuff on everywhere you go and then
I know.
You'll get jacked for sure.
Even when I'm like eating soup or something, I just have to have some BFR cuffs over my shoulders. Just out of interest, that study that you're talking about with just the biceps flexing in the air, was the frequency and the amount of reps the same across the groups? Do you know?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe volume was equated throughout as well. Volume in terms of reps. Obviously, you can't equate load,
No.
right? But reps for sure. Yeah, everything was equated in that sense.
That's very interesting. Okay, so it is literally about having that muscle tension and you mentally feeling that tension. So I think people listening to this podcast now are just going to be walking around all day, every day, just flexing their muscles.
Flexing all that. Yeah, at least you have a reason to flex now, right?
It would be interesting. So in terms of muscle activation, I did have a question come through actually on Instagram for this particular podcast. And in terms of muscle activation, we are talking about the quads in this scenario. Would you always recommend for hypertrophy circumstance to activate your quadricep by means of a leg extension before going on to something like a hack squat? Or would you do it the other way around? Or is there no particular difference in your perspective?
I mean, it just depends on what you're trying to accomplish for that given day, right? So if the idea is you're using leg extension to warm up for the hack squat, my question would be, do you really want to accumulate fatigue before your biggest movement when maybe your warm up could be a little bit more adequate to allow that to happen? Now, if you're trying to think about isolating a movement and challenging it within a shortened or a lengthened position before moving to a hack squat, that may not challenge it in those positions, right? So think about it in terms of leg extensions. If you look at the strength curve of a leg extension, right, it's going to be easier in the extended position to move, or in the flex position to move weight. But once you fully extended, it gets a lot harder. So it's harder in the shortened position to actually lift the weight. So maybe challenging that first before you get fatigued will allow you to hit those muscles a little bit harder in the shortened position. So then you go to something like a hack squat where your shortened position was already maxed and fatigued. Then you can do a hack squat and not really worry about having to get into that shortened position again later on down the training. Where if you did a leg extension at the end and you were already highly fatigued, you may not be able to recruit everything in that fully shortened position because you have those fatigue thresholds. So then it comes to the point of like, well, if the idea is, what drives muscle hypertrophy, you have mechanical tension, which is mainly the primary driver of that. Do you really want to fatigue your muscles before maybe your heaviest compound movement of the day that may drive as more adaptation to that muscle as possible? So then I would think about maybe looking at your hack squat and setting it up to be a more quad dominant movement if you're trying to get as much quad out of it as possible. So there's a lot of depends on that aspect of things. But I would say, personally, I would try to focus on not overly fatiguing a muscle before doing your heavier stuff first. I know that there's a lot of people who will do hamstring curls before a hack squat because it allows their knees to get a little bit warmer. It allows their hamstrings to maybe get some blood into them, so there's not as much stress on the knee. And there's probably no deleterious effect of doing hamstrings before a quad dominant hack squat. So that may be a way to get volume in and warm up. That's not necessarily going to take away from your ability to produce as much force as possible within a hack squat. Because if you're fatiguing a quad and then you're trying to produce as much force as possible, there's going to always be a drawback in your ability to produce that, right? Your phosphocreatine stores and glycolysis are all going to start to diminish as you start to work, and they'll never be fully replenished until after the workout. So you may be missing out on a rep or two. So it just depends on your style of training, what you're trying to get out of it. But I prefer trying to do my main movements, my heavy compound movements first without undue fatigue. But there's ways to warm up that will allow you to do that and prime those muscles so that you're not feeling like you need a leg extension to warm up.
That's cool. Yeah, that's a nice way of explaining it, actually. I've got another question, which is quite an interesting one from my perspective. And it was asked by a female. So, I mean, if it wasn't, then I want to know what kind of male this is. Right, hip thrusts. In comparison to strongmen, powerlifters, and bodybuilders, would you recommend it for all three?
It depends on what they're trying to get out of the movement. Again, that's going to be something that is really focusing on the fully shortened end of the glute. So if you're thinking about what may drive, well, one, for powerlifting and strongman, right, specificity is always going to reign supreme, and you don't want to create enough fatigue through a movement that doesn't necessarily have the best transfer and carryover into the actual sport. So if you're trying to grow your glutes and get stronger glutes, maybe because, you know, your glute, a lot of people say their glutes don't fire, or they have weak glutes, so they have lower back problems because of that. Doing something that doesn't necessarily isolate the glutes, I think would be a better driving force for a strongman or a powerlifter. So something like a stiff leg deadlift or an RDL might have a better transfer than doing something like a hip thrust. And if you're trying to focus on, you know, trying to get the glute as short as humanly possible, which the hip thruster does, then you can maybe add a band to your waist while you're doing a stiff leg deadlift. So that way you have to fully contract into the band to get your glutes as short as you can. But I think incorporating that with a hip extension movement that connects, you know, the biarticular joints of the hamstring and the hip is going to be a little bit more beneficial. When it comes to just purely isolation of the glute in terms of exercise selection, will the hip thrust necessarily be the best thing? And it depends, right? Like the research shows that it has pretty good benefits from an EMG perspective, but like we talked about before, that's because it's in the fully shortened position. EMG is always going to favor a fully shortened glute. So I think in terms of muscle action and trying to isolate the muscle, a hip thrust could be beneficial. It wouldn't be a primary movement pattern, but maybe also looking into things that have more of a deeper stretch of the glute as well. Something like a dumbbell step up or something along those lines could activate the glute just as good, if not better, because you're actually getting it fully lengthened and shortened as well. So hip thrusters could be beneficial if you're trying to get a fully shortened position out of the glute, but I don't necessarily think that would ever be a primary movement for any athlete. It may be one of those things that you can end a workout on or begin a workout with to just kind of warm things up, because I don't think it has a deleterious effect to a lot of movements if you fatigue a shortened glute.
Indeed. So would you use it more so for like metabolic stress? So maybe like a high rep kind of set at the end of a heavy leg session?
If your recovery demands allows it, yeah. I definitely think more of a metabolic stress would be a little bit of a better option when it comes to a hip thrust. Can you train it in the more of the 6 to 12 rep range? For sure, you can. I just don't necessarily think that that's going to be extremely beneficial, and it can be highly taxing because people can get really strong with a hip thrust. So to me, that stimulus to fatigue ratio doesn't necessarily preclude itself to that being the greatest driver. I would definitely do it more of on a metabolic, maybe some type of drop set or some type of giant set inclusion in there. That way you can maybe focus on trying to do the shortened end with the hip thruster. Then you can get it elongated with something along the lines of like a step up, and just kind of do those things back to back can be very beneficial. But I'm not a huge fan of isolating that movement.
That superset sounds disgusting, by the way.
Yeah, it's not fun.
No. It's one of those things where you just mention it and I'm like, I don't want to do that. That's horrible. But yeah. Right. Okay. So we are just about coming up on time here, Tony. So what I would like to go on in a wrap up kind of scenario, is there anything that you would like to end the mind muscle connection conversation on? And what are your top tips to give to the athletes who are listening?
Yeah, I would say just understand what outcome you're trying to drive, what adaptation you're trying to drive within your training. And then that should allow you to select your ability to do internal cueing versus external cueing, right? So if you're trying to fully focus on muscle action and isolation of a muscle, doing some type of internal cueing to get better activation and a better mind muscle connection is going to be far greater than doing some type of external cueing where you're just moving weight to move weight. But when it comes to heavier compound stuff, maybe focusing on that external cueing and moving it as fast as possible will still give you the same amount of muscle activation, right? As long as the eccentric is controlled, a fast concentric is always going to be something that you want to take on. So I think from a hypertrophy standpoint, focusing on those two things would be great. From a strength standpoint, I think that should be the same kind of carryover focus on, whenever you have some type of internal stability that you need to create on your own, whether it be like a back squat or a deadlift, external cues are going to be far better. And then when you have internal stability, like on a machine, maybe those internal cues are going to be better, and just depends on what you're trying to drive as far as the adaptation goes. So understand that they're both beneficial. Just knowing when to put them into your program is going to allow you to create the best stimulus possible.
Fantastic. Really love that. So, guys, that is basically the wrap up between myself and Tony on the Mind Muscle Connection conversation on Don't Fear the Weight. So thank you very much for tuning in. Tony, thank you so much for giving me your time today. I truly appreciate it. Just so people know where they can follow you, hound you, send you some questions and sign up to your awesome coaching. If you can just give me all of those links, we will put them in the bottom, of course, but just obviously give us a shout out for that.
Yeah, definitely. So on Instagram, it's just Tony Montgomery Jr. Even on Facebook, it's the same thing. I try to keep everything as simple as possible. So everything's just Tony Montgomery Jr. For coaching, you can go to teamphoenixperformance.com to sign up for either hypertrophy strength training or nutrition consultations. And then also too, I have Subject Zero Supplements, which is the supplement company that I own. So if you guys are interested in checking them out, everything's evidence-based and scientifically and ethically dosed. It's just subjectzerosups.com.
Cool. I'll get all of those links off you afterwards, and I'll put those in the comments, guys. If you can give us a like, give us a share, and that way I can carry on getting some more awesome guests on Don't Fear the Weight podcast. Until the next episode, thank you once again for listening, and I shall see you soon. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.